Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In a significant part of Book 6 of his Confessions, and in a few other mentions in later books, Augustine is going to discuss this younger friend of his, Alypius, who winds up becoming somebody he's quite close to, and he's an interesting contrast to Augustine himself on a number of different matters. So he begins in chapter 7 saying, those of us who live together as friends often lamented things, and I especially discussed them with Alypius and Nebridius. Alypius was born in the same town as I was, his parents among its leading citizens, but he was younger than I. He'd studied under me when I first began to teach in our hometown, so Thagaste, and later at Carthage. And he says he had a great devotion to me because I seemed, there's a big issue there, seemed to be well disposed towards him, which is true, and to be a learned man. Maybe not quite as true. And Augustine says, I liked him for a different reason. He had great natural virtue, which was outstanding in one who was not advanced in age. So he was a good kid, a decent kid, you could say. And then he says, well, unfortunately, he got sucked into some temptations. What was the temptation in Carthage? Augustine talks about it as being like a maelstrom, a whirlpool, the circus. And, makes sense, right, that he would use that metaphor because the circus is a round place. The people who are watching, the spectators, are seeing all sorts of things happening there. And Augustine says, while he was being tossed about in this, I was teaching rhetoric there, and he'd not heard me as a teacher because of a difference that arisen between his father and me. I learned that he loved the circus, and I was greatly disturbed. I thought he would ruin his promise, or had even ruined it all already, and I had no opportunity to recall him or warn him, whether out of friendly goodwill as just another person or by a teacher's authority. But Alypius starts showing up at Augustine's classes and lectures. He began to greet me, to come into my schoolroom, to listen to me for a while, then to go away. Now, this is where it gets really interesting as a story. Augustine says, I forgot about this issue with the circus, and I was focused on my work, and, it was good to have him there. So I got used to do something good despite what I was actually trying to do. So here's the story. On a certain day, as I sat in my usual place and the students were present with me, he came in, greeted me, sat down, and applied his mind to the subjects under discussion. By chance, there was a passage to be read lying in my hands. As I was explaining it, I thought a comparison with the circus would be appropriate, by which what I wished to say would become both clearer and more pleasant to those who such madness held captive by some means of biting sarcasm at their expense. So he's saying, I'm going to mess with these people and kind of make fun of them a bit in the way that I express this similitude to the circus. So he does that. And Augustine says, I had no thought of curing Alypius of his disease. However, Alypius is going to apply this to himself. And Augustine is really struck here by a comparison. He takes the criticism to heart. And where he says another person would take as an occasion for anger with me, getting angry, suspendum. So this is a verb, getting angry at, really, really angry. Who are you to say these sorts of things? Alypius gets angry with himself about the fact that he's got this flaw. And this leads him to actually, as Augustine says, to love him more ardently. And it's, Augustine is saying this is actually God working. It's not me, because I didn't have any intention of fixing him at that point. So as we read here, upon hearing these words, he burst forth from that deep pit in which he'd willingly plunged himself and wherein he was blinded with strange pleasures. He shook his mind with a vigorous self-control, temperantia, right? Temperance is another way of typically expressing or translating that. And all the filth of the circus fell from him. And so he prevails on his unwilling father, says, I want to study with Augustine. They begin studying together. The only flaw with that at this point in the story is that Augustine is still very interested in the Manichaeans, and Alypius, as somebody who is self-controlled, thinks that the Manichaean show of continentia, is something really good. So he's also kind of drawn into that as well. He then goes to Rome. His parents want him to have a public career, and he goes to study law, but then he falls again. This time it's the gladiatorial contests. And he's actually making a pretty good job of not getting drawn in. He doesn't go to the gladiatorial contest by himself. He's dragged along by some friends. He gets there and he's like, you know what? I'm just not going to look. I'll put my hands above my eyes and then I won't be bothered by it. Even if you drag my body into this place, you can't fasten my mind and eyes on these shows. I will be absent though present, and I will overcome both you and them. And then he hears the crowd roar, and curiosity draws him in and opens up his eyes. And Augustine says the result was there was wounded and struck down a spirit. And here's another comparison that was rather bold, audax, than strong, fortus. So he doesn't really have the inner strength that he desires to have. He saw that blood, he drank in savageness the same time. He did not turn away, fixed his sight on it. He took delight in that evil struggle, and he became drunk on blood and pleasure. He was no longer the man who entered there, but only one of the crowd he joined. And so this was something that he had to fight against later on. And Augustine says, his mistake, and it's a mistake that Augustine himself understands quite well, was relying on himself, on his spirit, rather than relying on God. But he didn't know that he could draw on God for that. Then we get this very interesting story that happens in Carthage about this thief. So Alypius gets himself into some trouble because there's a thief who is stealing stuff using a hatchet, right? And the thief does his thing, steals his stuff, leaves the hatchet behind, and Alypius comes, walking along, and you know exactly where this is going. He's like, oh, what's happening here? And then the other people show up, and by the time that they do, Alypius has the hatchet in his hand. So they're like, you're the thief. You're stealing this stuff. And he gets in trouble. Fortunately, it all works out. So there's an architect who is in charge of public buildings, and all people who were suspected by him of stealing goods that were lost from the marketplace were, he said, particularly glad to have met him so he might learn by whom the thefts were actually committed. But he'd seen Alypius before, and so he asks him what's going on, and he takes him away from the crowd. Then they go to the house of the young man who committed the deed. There's a young servant there, and they're like, "Whose hatchet is this?" And they're like, "Oh, that's our hatchet." So he gets free of this. Alypius learns a lesson, which is people are pretty rash to judge, and it's really easy to condemn people without actually knowing the facts of the case. So, it's an interesting little teaching passage. Then there's a discussion about him as a public official. So he goes to study law, and then he starts applying law. And we find out that he sat 3 times as an assessor with an integrity that it was a matter of wonder to other men, though he wondered himself more at those who preferred money to honesty. And he's tested by the bait held out not just to avarice, but also the pressure of fear. So there's a particular case. There's a person who is used to getting away with stuff because he's quite powerful. He's a senator. And so he desired permission be given to him for something that was forbidden by law. Alypius says, nope, not going to go for that. Everyone else is going along with it. So first, they're asking him, won't you just, go along to get along? And he says, nope, it wouldn't be right. Then he's tried to be bribed, right? They're going to give him some sort of carrot, and then comes the stick, of course. He holds out against the bribe. They start making threats, and he doesn't go along with the threats, and everybody's amazed because they're like, wow, this guy really has integrity. However, he does have a temptation. So, he's only human. What is his temptation? His zeal for study. He wanted to have books copied for him at palace prices. Now, we probably need to say a little bit about this, just in case people are not familiar with how things worked in ancient times. So why would you pay to have books copied? Well, because that's how books were actually produced. They were copied by hand. There were no printing presses at the time. So you would pay people, scribes, who were copiers of the materials and who charged a good bit of money, not just for the materials, but also for their labor. Books were kind of, an expensive commodity at the time. But you could get them at reduced prices if you were a public official. And so Alypius says, yeah, this would be great. I can expand my library. But then he decides that it wouldn't be just to do that. And Augustine brings up this biblical verse. This is but a small matter, but he who is faithful in what is little is faithful also in the great. And then, there's a question, are you favoring or prioritizing money over justice? So that's not something that Alypius is going to do. So we get to see his character quite well. We also get some interesting discussions coming up later in this book about marriage. And here, Augustine almost screws things up for Alypius. So we read, Alypius kept me from marrying because he repeated over and over again that if I did so, we wouldn't live together in unbroken leisure and love of wisdom as we desired. He was living the life of strictest chastity, so that it was a source of admiration to me. And we find out that he's not a virgin. In early adolescence, he had some experience with sex, but had not persisted in it. On the contrary, he repented of it, turned away from it, and from that time on lived in complete continence. So that's Alypius. What's the case with Augustine? Not that at all, right? So a little bit later on, we read, for the most part, the habit of satisfying an insatiable appetite grievously tormented me. It's captive, right? He likes to have sex. He's got a concubine. He actually has a kid with her. And, he's talking about marriage. Now, Augustine is going to bring up examples of married men who cherished wisdom and gained merit before God and faithfully kept and loved their friends, saying, hey, you can be married and do all these other things that we value. But interestingly, Augustine says, I didn't actually have the best motives for that. As if my wound had been struck, I repelled his good and persuasive words. Through me, the serpent, the devil, spoke to Alypius. By my tongue, he wove sweet snares and placed them upon his path so that his free and virtuous feet might be entangled. And then Alypius starts thinking about this, and he's wondering or marveling that Augustine couldn't live a celibate life. And when he's astonished, Augustine says, well, there's a big difference between what he had taken quickly and furtively that he couldn't hardly remember. So sex back in, teenage years. And then the full experience of sexual delights and pleasures. I understand this quite well, Augustine is saying. And then he says, if we added the honored name of matrimony, then he ought not to wonder why I could not despise that way of life. So Alypius then says, maybe there's something to this. I'm kind of curious about what it is that you're getting out of this. And we see he began to desire to marry, not because he was overcome by lust for such pleasure, which Augustine certainly has, but out of curiosity. He said he wanted to know what that might be, without which my life, which pleased him so, seemed to me not life, but punishment. A mind free from bondage wondered at my servitude, and from wonder passed into a desire to experience it. Next, he might go on to the experience itself and then fall into the very slavery at which he wondered. So Augustine is not saying that that's what actually happened, but he was on the wrong path, getting led astray, sort of like with the gladiatorial thing by his stupid friend who doesn't really have it together, right? It's a very interesting passage here, isn't it? Going on a little bit further, we find that he has some interesting discussions with not just Alypius, but also Nebritus. And there's a little bit of a mistranslation in some of the English translations here. So discussion about the final causes of good and evil. So final causes is just the translation de finibus, the ends is typically how we translate that. And there's a good reason, because Cicero actually wrote a book, De Finibus, and it's the De Finibus, Bonorum et Malorum, of goods and evils, sort of looking at what is considered to be the highest good, or the good we should prioritize the most, and the worst evil. So they are debating moral philosophy together. And it's interesting that Augustine here will mention as a side note, Epicurus would have won if I had not believed that after death there remains for the soul life and rewards and punishment, which Epicurus doesn't believe in. So you could say he is pretty Epicurean in his mindset at that point in time. In Book 7, we have another reference to Alypius, and it's Augustine and Alypius both getting things partly right, partly wrong in what we call their Christology, right? Their understanding of who this Jesus Christ person was. So he says, I conceived my Lord Christ as only a man of surpassing wisdom, who no other man could equal. I didn't really understand things like the Word was made flesh and all of that. He's going to move on from that. But he says that Alypius thought that Catholics believed that God was clothed in flesh in such wise that in Christ there was no soul, in addition to his divinity in his body, nor did he think a human mind was attributed to him. and he finds out later that this is the error of the Apollonian heretics, and so then he moves away from that, and that's basically where that discussion ends. And it's coming up within a context of thinking about whether pagan philosophy is getting things right or not. Then they talk in Book 8 about Alypius being there with Augustine in the garden, the famous garden where Augustine is struggling once again with the desire for sex and wishing that he, on the one hand, didn't have to give it up, but on the other hand, recognizing, yeah, I do need to actually finally get it together. I recognize where I want to be, and this is holding me back. And there's this voice of a child, right? Alypius is seeing Augustine deeply affected, awaiting the outcome of his strange emotion, and he arises from Alypius's side and goes further apart so that not even his presence would be a hindrance. And then he hears the child saying, "Take up and read," right? So then he says, "I hurried back to the spot where Alypius was sitting. I had put there the volume of the Apostle. When I got up and left him, I snatched it up, opened it, and read in silence the chapter on which my eyes first fell." So he discusses this with Alypius. "I told it all to Alypius, what had taken place in him, which I did not know about. He then made known to me." And then they go to his mom, Monica, and explain what's going on to her. And then finally, in Book 9, we find out that when the time arrived for me to give in my name, we left the country and returned to Milan. Alypius likewise resolved to be born again in you, in company with me, for he was now clothed with that humility which befits your sacraments. So he and Augustine and a Deodatus are going to become baptized. All of them at the same time and together. So very interesting reflections on somebody who is quite important in Augustine's life, somebody who has some things in common with him, but is different from him in other important and we might even say complementary respects.